Hey everyone, this is Brian from the Tennis IQ podcast. Josh and I hope that you are enjoying the content and discussions that we put out week after week. If you'd like to support the podcast and help us to continue to produce quality episodes, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Currently, we have 3 tiers of support: the fan level at $3 per month, the supporter level at $7 per month, and the champion level at $20 per month. Benefits of joining the Tennis IQ podcast community include episode transcripts, participation in book club discussions, and access to monthly masterclasses with me and Josh. For more on these benefits of support, head on over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Thank you so much. And now, on to the show. Hello and welcome to the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Brian Lomax.
And I'm Josh Berger. For today's episode, we are going to be discussing the connection between our identity, our behaviors, and our feelings. And we'll talk about each of these different pieces, and we can talk about how our self-image, which is another way to think about our identity, can really connect and be impacted by each of these different pieces, and how essentially the order that we go about things in, right? If we're starting with that identity piece, and we're starting with sort of how we see ourselves, how we want to see ourselves, and the behaviors that are attached to that, how that can lead to the types of feelings that we want, rather than the other way around, where we're starting with the feelings, we're starting with how do I feel about a situation? Do I want to do the habit, the behavior, the action? And then that leading to some sort of identity. We'll talk about how starting with identity first, and really prioritizing that, and really being really clear, crystal clear about that as a starting point, can help to lead to the types of behaviors and actions that we want, that ultimately lead to us being the best version of ourselves in a tennis context, and what that can really look like. And I think we've maybe mentioned this a little bit. There's a book, Arate, by Brian Johnson, that we've looked at some different passages from, and there's a couple passages in particular that I think we may be bringing up that really relate to this concept.
And I think if we start with what you mentioned, Josh, the concepts of feelings, behaviors, identity, we really want to compare and contrast 2 pathways through that, which is, the first way, which is probably the more normal way that people go about their lives, is that they have certain feelings, and based on how they feel, they may or may not do a behavior. And then the behavior that they do then leads to some sort of sense of a self-image or who they are, an identity. And, in this situation, we don't necessarily want to be that normal response. We want to actually take it to another level, to be more intentional, and understand that the better pathway is to have some sort of identity or self-image. You could even, I think, Josh, throw in maybe a virtue, and I'll give an example of that. And then understand the behaviors of that identity or self-image, and then know that those behaviors will create the feelings or even the psychological state that we wish to feel. So I'll give it a virtue example, because I'm sure you tell this to clients as well, is you might ask them, all right, do you believe that confidence is a choice? And some will say maybe yeah or whatever, and then you can talk about it. Well, confidence can be a choice. And how do you choose to be confident? Well, you choose to be confident through, number one, your body language. So that's a behavior. And so if the virtue is confidence, the behavior is great body language, great presence, then how are you going to feel after you do that for a little while? You're going to feel a little bit more confident. You're going to feel a little bit more comfortable. As opposed to, well, I'm not feeling confident, and then that maybe leads to me doing other things. And then that sort of ends up as me being a not very confident player out there. And so the pathway here that we're advocating is have an image of yourself, have an identity of who you want to be. And maybe that identity is connected with certain virtues like confidence or courage or whatever. Those can then drive behaviors. And then that can drive how you feel, can drive your psychological state. And I think that's a really important message for everyone, because when we talk about mental performance training, a big part of this is mastering yourself, the art of self-mastery. And this is a pathway in which you learn to begin to master yourself. And when we say master yourself, it's really mastering how you respond to your own thoughts and emotions, how you respond to the world, and creating an identity or a self-image that is connected to virtues, which is connected to behaviors, will help you to deal with all of that a little bit better. As we go along, Josh, we can talk perhaps about what are some self-images or identities that could be helpful. But I just wanted to see any thoughts on what I just said there with respect to the two pathways.
Yeah, and I think I like the way that you outlined that, and I think if we're thinking about sort of the default pathway, we're starting with our feelings. We're starting with, all right, how do I feel today? Do I want to train? Do I want to work on my strength and conditioning? Do I want to engage with certain habits and behaviors on the mental side of the game? Maybe things like meditation or visualization or things like that I could be doing off court. So if we're starting with how we feel and whether we feel like doing something or not, it's going to lead to a certain level of inconsistency. It's going to lead to, I would say, sort of to me, and Brian, you mentioned this before we started recording, but I think it's a really important point. To me, it's not necessarily a professional approach, right? That's not necessarily the professional way of engaging with things. It's more of maybe an amateur approach, or more of sort of the default, right? I'm not, saying that you can't be thinking about things like that, but I think it more so is the default state where it's like, okay, this is how I feel, and based on that, this is what I'm going to do today and this week, and et cetera, et cetera. And I think a different way to think about that is that other pathway where we're starting with the identity piece. And I know we've talked about James Clear in the past, and he talks about a lot about identity in Atomic Habits, and how, if somebody, let's say, wants to become a runner, and they're starting with that identity piece and identifying as a runner, then there's certain behaviors that are attached to that, right? There's certain behaviors that a runner does. A runner maybe is waking up and running in the mornings before they get started with their work, get started with their day. And maybe because of that, they're going to bed early. And maybe because of that, they're laying out their clothes the night before. And then their nutrition looks a certain way. So because of that identity piece, that leads to those select behaviors. And then through engaging in those behaviors, we can feel pretty confident that that's going to lead to certain feelings. So rather than starting with that feeling piece, we're getting ourselves to, through putting identity first, we're getting ourselves to engage in these behaviors and trusting that that leads to certain types of feelings rather than the feeling piece coming first.
And you brought up, our prior conversation with respect to professional versus amateur. Yeah, you could call the amateur the default. I'm cool with that. But usually, like if I were to call you an amateur, Josh, you would probably feel a bit insulted. And so even though amateur, on its own, the word means that you love what you do. Stephen Pressfield, in his book, The War of Art, he makes this distinction between professionals and amateurs, that yes, amateur means that you love what you do, but in his mind, the professional loves it more because they're more dedicated to practicing whatever their art is. And in our context, it's tennis. And James Clear also talks a lot about the professional versus the amateur, and I think it's related to this pathway. So what he has said, and this is in his book, Atomic Habits, that Amateurs will do the right things, the right habits when they feel like it. When the moment strikes them. And and then, that'll drive whatever. Professionals do the right things and the right habits whether they feel like it or not. And they do it at the right times. And that's, again, back to self-mastery. If we really want to master our own thoughts and emotions and behaviors, well, we have to bring a more professional approach to our tennis. And it doesn't have to be, just because we're using the word professional does not mean you have to all of a sudden adopt the pre-match routine of Novak Djokovic or Iga Swiatek. It's more or less just knowing where you are right now. What are the important habits that you need to have that would help you be more successful? Perhaps it's a 5-minute meditation habit. Maybe it's planning out your next day as part of your evening routine. Little things that are easy. Josh, you use an app to help you with habits. I use actually the James Clear habit journal to help me with specific habits that I want to do. And I see how I do with those things. Sometimes I miss, sometimes I don't. But it gives me a really good visual on that. So for me to be professional, even in, my job and what you do, there are certain things that need to happen every single day. And I do those things every day. I don't do them just because I feel like it. I do it because it's necessary. And many of us have something like that in our lives, whether it's school, whether it's our job. You can bring the same approach to your tennis and to really turn pro in your mind. And then that opens up, to me, Josh, opens up the possibility of fulfilling your potential or approaching that. The other pathway in which we let how we feel drive what we do, it becomes a more limiting way of approaching your tennis game. You can obviously still get better, but the ceiling of your potential is far lower than if you were to approach it as a professional who knows what he or she should be doing and does those things habitually, whether you feel like it or not. And to me, that's the really important part of understanding identity and self-image is to not limit ourselves. It is to open up that pathway to the possibility of becoming our best selves, whether that's through, as a tennis player or even as a person.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely true. And when it comes to, to being a professional or taking things in a professional way, yeah, that doesn't mean that you have to actually be at the professional level, right? And you're not on the ATP WTA tour, and I don't think anybody is expecting that, right? Regardless of your level. I think it's about, you know, are you doing everything that you can do, right? Are you doing everything that you can do to be your best, and your best regardless of age, regardless of experience, of capability. A lot of these different factors is going to look a little different. What everyone's best is going to look a little bit different. But I think, to me, somebody deciding to sort of go about this professional approach, to me, it means that they are controlling the controllables. They are focusing on their process. They are focusing on what they need to do on a day-to-day basis, and really building those consistent habits so that they don't need to decide every day. So that it's not a decision of whether I want to work on my game, whether I want to eat in a certain way, whether I want to do these behaviors. It's become habit. And I don't think that it's become habit, it's become routine. And it doesn't, I think, for everybody, it doesn't start there. We build up to that. We build up to that. We work on that. It's not necessarily easy to get to that point, but I think there's quite a bit of benefits from that. Whether and yeah, whether it's a physical habit tracker, whether it's an app on your phone, having some sort of way to, whether it's a journal, having some sort of way to measure your progress is, I think, really key. And I've had different habits in the past that I've built and tried to build more or less successfully. And I think to me, that measurement piece is really key, really, really key, just to see the progress. And that doesn't mean, I think if we're being realistic, for most people, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be doing the habit every single day. And that doesn't mean that there's not going to be a week where maybe we fall off a little bit because life happens, right? We're not if you're not a professional athlete, you do generally have other priorities as well, other things that come up in life. So to me, it's not about being perfect. It's not about being perfect. It's not about even holding unrealistic standards or expectations for ourselves. It's can we make progress in these areas and can we track and measure that progress, which I think leads to a certain type of momentum. And I think what we see on a day to day, week to week basis, as we're building that habit, we can really see ourselves building momentum. And I think you can have that snowball effect where we're starting with, okay, this is my identity. I'm have an identity as a writer, let's just say, which is something I've been trying to do more and more of. And okay, if that's where the identity starts, then what are the behaviors and actions and habits that are associated with that? Maybe that means reading more. Maybe that means writing more. Maybe that means making sure that my writing space, my office, or wherever I may be at a particular time, is set up for me to write effectively, right? So, what are the behaviors and actions that need to take place in order to um, yeah to really fit with that identity that we're creating, and then and then understanding that the feelings is sort of that third piece where it's like, okay, if I can engage with those behaviors that I'm trying to engage with, how am I going to feel about myself? How am I going to feel when the task is finished? How am I going to feel at the end of the week when I've done the habit that I'm trying to achieve 5 out of 7 days, right? Can we think about that? And I think, a way to think about this as well is, we can sort of think about sort of our old selves and sort of this new self, this new type of person that we're striving to be. And I think actually and they talk about this in the book as well, but there's a visualization component that can be helpful here as well, where it's like, can we visualize ourselves at our best? Can we visualize ourselves at our best? Can we visualize ourselves as, you know, acting in this way that we want to be? And then try to really act as if, act as if we are them, right? So it's not a matter of faking it till you make it. It's more of, okay, I am trying to become this type of a person and moving towards being this type of a person. And can I, during that process, before and during that process, can I sort of visualize myself as that person, right? If I'm, can I visualize myself as a writer and somebody that writes on a regular basis? Can I visualize, somebody that myself as somebody that really moves their feet well on the tennis court whenever they play and really engages with their footwork from an effort standpoint, from a technical standpoint? Can I, sort of start with that piece in terms of how I see myself? And I think the specific skill of visualization can help with how we see ourselves and our self-image and our identity. And then based on that, really engage with those behaviors, and make them habit, make them routine, and make them ultimately automatic.
So I want to go back to something you said and maybe turn it around on you, Josh, a little bit here. So you've mentioned, you're developing this writing habit, and we're looking at the pathway here of identity, behaviors, feelings. So you've started to take on the identity as a writer. You have a writing now habit. Can you describe for us the feelings that you do have when you finish a writing session?
Great question. Yes, and it really has been, and to open up on that a little bit, which I don't think I've talked about here. Have sort of in the back of my head for a while thought about writing a book. It's been a sort of a long-term goal of mine for a while, but I'd say it's been pretty vague in terms of not knowing exactly what I wanted that to look like or not having a specific idea. But I think that has changed in these, well, this year, really the beginning of this year, and now have a specific idea that I'm working towards, and as part of that, have started to form this habit of writing on a consistent basis, as I work towards that goal. And to answer your question, I would say some of the main feelings that come up are a feeling of accomplishment, a feeling of just a feeling that I am working towards something, which is a really nice feeling to have. I would say those are a couple of the main ones that come up. I think also, just a feeling of enjoyment that when I can get myself to do it, when I do engage with the process, that I really do enjoy the process, sort of, have found myself in that state of flow at certain points, or just, have also found myself more in that sort of writer's block state as well. So it's certainly not always like that, but I think that there really are a lot of positive emotions attached to that, both in terms of enjoying that process, but also, the achievement or accomplishment piece. And it's not like if the end goal is writing this book, which it is, not waiting until getting to that point to celebrate that accomplishment, right? So obviously that is the end goal, but can I celebrate carving out an hour weekly to work on this? Can I celebrate myself starting to form some of these different chapters? Can I celebrate that outline starting to come together? Can I celebrate, each of these chapters starting to take form? And I think being able to recognize those important steps and those accomplishments. Yeah, I think there's certainly a feeling of, yeah, that I've almost that I'm doing what I set out to, that I'm being accountable, that I'm being accountable to myself, right? Nobody's telling me I need to do this writing. No one is holding my feet to the fire, so to speak. But I think and I appreciate you asking me the question, because I think it caused me to reflect on it more. But I think it more probably more than anything is a feeling of accountability to myself, where it's like, okay, I have set out this identity, I've set out this goal, and now that I have been engaging with the behaviors associated with it, there definitely is a sense of, yeah, both accomplishment and accountability, that is a really nice feeling.
So what I'm hearing is kind of like a potpourri here of different feelings, all really positive. There's that a sense of accomplishment, sense that you're working towards something. There's a lot of enjoyment involved, and I think didn't necessarily say this, Josh, but there's probably a bit in there that you're working on a craft like writing. Perhaps it's improving. Maybe you're also enjoying learning a little bit more about what you're writing about, and in terms of the topic, you might be gaining some additional insight, and that's cool and exciting. That's something that we can bring to people. And then I like the fact that you're using the word celebrate. We had an episode on mini wins, and part of today's episode has to be a little bit about the celebration factor, whether that's saying something like, that's like me to do my writing today, I feel good about it, or just internally feeling good, feeling proud, feeling satisfied. And I think this is a great example of you having a particular habit you want to commit to. You identify as a writer, you're doing the behavior, and then look what happens. as opposed to maybe, I don't really feel like writing today. Not gonna do it. I'm tired. I'm going back to bed. Whatever. And then it just doesn't get done, and that's going to lead to a whole different set of feelings. Maybe later, like, oh, I should have written today. Now I feel bad about those things. So just by being professional with this, it's a really good example, I think, of how that can drive certain things. And it's good. I'm glad that we kind of forced you to interpret how you are feeling with this habit, because hopefully even that reflection gets you to be like even more excited to do this work, because clearly you enjoy it. And this book is, whenever it comes out, is something that will be your gift to the world, which is really cool. So let's transition. You started to talk about act as if. Let's get into that a little bit more. Really the first time I had heard about this might have been Amy Cuddy's TED Talk about body language. Now, to be clear, she did use the phrase "fake it till you make it." Now, I feel like she did that with very positive intent. Over the years, that I think that phrase has been twisted into something that was not its original intent, to almost like fake that something when you don't, that kind of thing. But I would agree, when we use the phrase act as if, it's better. We're not faking it. That sounds sort of not genuine. But if I'm asking you to act as if you're a professional, or I could even say, Josh, I want you to act as if you're the world's greatest tennis player. Okay? What would the world's greatest tennis player do right now? And then you have a whole set of behaviors, or what are the virtues of the world's greatest tennis player? And that gives you a whole set of things to think about. And so, world's greatest tennis player doesn't have to be your particular identity. It could be, you're an elite level, you're a professional, you see yourself just as a great tennis player. You see yourself as a warrior, a fighter, a battler, whatever it is, champion. Really, it's up to you to determine what that is. But I feel like, Josh, when I work with a lot of players, the default is none. There's no real concept here. And therefore, there's no attachment to specific virtues that are important, which then don't really lead to all the productive behaviors that we need. And so that, I think, to me, that's one of the defaults. Then the other thing that happens, and I'm sure you notice this as well, is people will adopt a self-limiting image or identity. A very simple sort of situational example might be, I always start my matches slowly. Okay? That is a kind of an identity. I'm a slow starter. And that's your self-image. Really difficult to outperform that image. If that's who you think you are, it's going to be difficult to consistently get off to good starts in matches. You're already setting yourself up. And so if your identity is somebody who starts off slowly, well, then you're going to adopt the behaviors of a slow starter, whatever that is. And then at the end of the first 3 games, you're going to be like, yep, told you. I always start slowly. Yeah, here we go again. I always start slowly. And it becomes a recurring pattern. So that's an example of how our self-image or identity can really limit us. And it's important to recognize this happens not only situationally, but it could happen more broadly, whether that's I have no identity at all, or I have a self-limiting identity. Maybe I just don't see myself as someone who can win matches, or I don't think I'm that good. And then it can also happen situationally. Start of a match, finish a match. I always lose these games, right? Those, whether they're situational or not, they connect to how you feel about yourself. They connect to your self-image. They connect to your identity. And I think it's very important that every player kind of interrogate themselves. What am I thinking of myself here? How do I view my ability to perform in this situation? Am I limiting it? Or am I opening up the possibility that will allow me to be my best here. And yeah, we talked about pessimism and optimism and how pessimism is often a way to reduce the uncertainty of a situation because, quite frankly, it can feel bad to put your entire effort into something and lose. Whether this sounds perverse or not, it's much easier to assume you'll lose, and then you're like, yeah, I knew it was going to lose, versus really putting yourself out on the line and losing. That's tough, but that again is the path to becoming better, to becoming great at what you're doing. So I just want to stop there, Josh, and get your thoughts on the whole act as if piece and limiting identities and maybe building ones that open up our potential.
Yeah, I think to me, I see two different pieces of it. I see one piece in terms of really being intentional with our identity, really trying to craft, okay, this is how I see myself. This is the type of person I strive to be. And I see the other piece of that as almost catching ourselves when we're falling back into an old identity or into something that's more self-limited, something that's more pessimistic, something where we're clearly not helping ourselves. And I think it's so I think both of those pieces are really important. Are we being deliberate and intentional with crafting our own, crafting our self-identity and how we see ourselves and how we want to be and how we or are we able to, and the other piece being, are we able to, yes, be aware and bring that awareness to understanding how am I seeing myself moment by moment, right? And for that can shift, based on what's happening, right? I mean, ideally, we're starting with that identity piece as we're talking about as we've talked about throughout this episode, but if we do find ourselves falling back into sort of that default pathway of starting with our feelings, then we wind up with behaviors and then identity, can we think about, okay, is the is the sort of overarching self-identity that I have, is that holding me back here? Is that somehow limiting myself? And I think if we can be aware of that as it's happening, then it's a lot easier to address it. So I think, and I we've talked about this in other episodes, but I think that awareness piece can connect to so many different pieces of the mental game, whether it's our self-talk, whether it's how are we spending time between points and our breathing, whether it's am I rushing, whether it's am I aware of how prepared I feel going into a match. I think the awareness piece can really connect to a lot of different things that we can talk about. But I think especially with the identity piece, if we're aware of how am I framing things, am I holding myself back with this identity, with the identity that I've essentially chosen in that moment, and the way that I've been seeing things. If I'm aware of that, then I can make an adjustment or make a change. But it's really hard or maybe impossible to do that until we recognize it's happening.
And one twist on the act as if, and I heard this many years ago, and it was around act as if, and we could almost use as our identity our favorite player. So I could say, Josh, today, I don't know who your favorite player is. I'm going to make it up. I'm going to say Rafael Nadal is your favorite player, right? So today, you're going to go on the court and you're going to be Rafael Nadal. And in fact, you are auditioning for the part of Rafael Nadal in a movie that we're making about him. So everything that you do on the court today, you're going to do it as if you were him. All right. Now you're righty, he's lefty. We'll just flip around the camera for that. It's amazing what can happen when you try to play a role. And now you're really embodying, right, all the positive virtues of this player that you really look up to, who does things the right way. We're not going to ask you to do. I mean, they're human, so obviously all the players that we watch on television or whatever, they have their moments where they're not perfect, but that's not what we're looking for, right? We're looking kind of like for the idealized version of Rafael Nadal. So it might be, he's a good guy watching what he does between points. Takes plenty of time. It might be the hustle piece, the relentless piece. Maybe it's the heavy topspin on the forehand. Lots of different things that taking someone like that as kind of like your sage, your ideal role model, and adopting it and just trying it out one day while you play, whoever that favorite player is. And I've tried that. Not that Roger Federer is necessarily my favorite player, but there are aspects of my game that might be more similar to him than others. And I remember one day I tried that, Josh, and we've hit together. I probably sliced my backhand more than I should. But that day, I was ripping one-handed backhand drives because I had this image of Roger in my mind about how he does that. And it just sort of flowed through my body. I was acting as if I were Roger Federer. So I think that's kind of a cool and unique twist that we as tennis players can take on this whole thing. It doesn't mean you always have to do it that way, but experiment with that. See what that does for you. Pick the best of, your favorite player. Maybe you put two together and see what happens on the court.
I really like that, and I think I would encourage people to try that and see how it goes. I think people will definitely find benefits of that, and there's whether a favorite player or a player that you really look up to. Yeah, I think there's a lot of benefits to that. To me, it also reminds me of from the book The Inner Game of Tennis, which has been around for 50 plus years at this point. He talks about Tim Galloway, the author, talks about from a technique perspective, imagining that somebody is photographing you, imagining that Sports Illustrated is taking photos of you, and you're essentially just trying to show what what the forehand is supposed to look like or what the serve is supposed to look like, and almost acting as if you have perfect form, perfect technique in some of these ways because Sports Illustrated is there. And I think it really connects to what you're saying, right? Where I think it's not just about technique in your example, right? It's maybe the top spin of Nadal's forehand or the intensity that he brings, or it's Federer or Djokovic ripping a backhand, or the to me, I think the swinging volley is a particularly I think it's a pretty challenging shot. I think if we watch certain pros, I think of actually Federer and Serena as particular examples who just make it look so easy. But I think I just find it to be a challenging shot. And if we can imagine ourselves as those people, and it doesn't mean we're copying their form, but can we take certain attributes, right? Whether it's the intensity, whether it's the confidence that they bring into the shot, whether it's, maybe the top spinner, the way that they move their feet or something like that. I think that's great advice. I think that people can definitely benefit quite a bit from that.
So, Josh, any last thoughts as we wrap up on identity, behaviors, feelings?
I would say, and I think this maybe summarizes things a little bit, but really trying to think about, okay, who do you want to be? Sounds like a very simple question, but I think meditating on that a little bit can lead to a lot of different answers and a lot of insight often. And if we're thinking about who we want to be, okay, then what behaviors does that person do? And how can can you really commit to those types of behaviors, understanding that that will lead you to feel a certain way, and not doing those behaviors will lead to, a different set of feelings. But, really starting with that question, who do I want to be? And that's what I would say. Can we really start there? Can we spend a little bit of time thinking about that, thinking about a question as simple as that, but really trying to think that through.
Great way to summarize it, Josh. And I think if listeners would love to, we'd love to hear what identities you choose and maybe particular players that you want to maybe emulate, copy, whatever on the court, and how that goes would be wonderful to hear. So, well, that's our show for today. Thank you all for listening. For more on today's episode, please check out the show notes. If you have any feedback or questions for me and Josh, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the content that Josh and I discuss on the show, please rate and review the podcast so other tennis enthusiasts can find it more easily. Additionally, to be notified of new episodes, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube, and you can also check us out on Instagram. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership, where you can learn about the benefits of being part of the Tennis IQ podcast community. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.